What's up, everybody? Welcome to Podcast Now. I'm Alex, and I'm again joined by Evan Filarca. Evan, we're going to be having a pretty fun discussion in this video. Firstly, let me say, and I'll let you say your opening. If you guys are not already subscribed to him, he does I truly do believe this, honestly does a phenomenal job at covering, especially what we're going to be talking about in this video. All right, we've talked about Avengers, but I don't know any other word to call him, but the king of talking about Spider-Man coverage. So, Evan, you've done a phenomenal job with Miles. Thank you a ton for coming on this channel to talk about the ending to it.
Well, I'm extremely humbled by your super kind words, Alex. That truly means the world to me. And I'm just so honored to be here again talking about Spider-Man with you, because talking about this character with someone who cares about him just as much just makes it all the more worthwhile for someone like me. So I can't wait to get into the topic today.
And so we're gonna, this is a discussion like normally on this channel that we do, but we do want to kind of talk about, maybe where this game could end, leading in, if it will lead into Spider-Man 2. Lots of questions like that. So Evan, let me kind of start off with that. So we know, and again, you've covered this game, all the way, right? So you are probably the go-to source, I would say, for any info. We know this game is not like a purely DLC thing, right? It's not. I mean, it is a spin-off. You could call it, I would guess, a spin-off story, but it is very concrete and just on its own. But let's not hide the fact that we know, right, Insomniac, they have lots of teams, lots of people that work there. They're making Spider-Man 2. This game probably will lead. Now, I've been saying this, and this is just a theory. I do think this game will lead directly into a Spider-Man 2. So let me just start off with that. Let me get your opinion on that. Do you think this game, whether it be an end credit thing, whether it be maybe the last boss fight, however they want to do it, do you think this will lead into a Spider-Man 2?
I think that's 110% the case. In previous interviews with both the creative director of Miles Morales and Spider-Man PS4, so two Brians, Brian Horton and Brian Intar, they pretty much have gone back and forth with each other, saying that we are currently working on our next step within the Marvel Spider-Man franchise with the essential storytelling piece of Miles Morales becoming his own hero, individualizing him as his own Spider-Man, what makes him so different from Peter, and just showcasing how special he can be as a standalone character. So that's why they're doing this game, to fully flesh out Miles as his own, and then that will most likely lead into the official sequel of Marvel's Spider-Man 2, which again, they have also pretty much confirmed in their own interviews on the PlayStation blog website and just certain news posts, saying that we have a lot of stuff going on for the future of this series, and Brian Intihar, who made the first game, is thinking of a lot of different things on where to take the series next. So Brian Horton is leading off this Miles adventure, but Brian Intihar, who made Spider-Man PS4, is pretty much going to be the mastermind of showing where they can take Peter next, where they can take Miles next, and where they can take them both together as Spider-Men. Especially now, we got the tease of Miles in the Silver Lining DLC. We now are going to get his own game. And by the end of the story, I'm assuming he'll now have fully realized his full potential as a hero with the Venom powers, his swinging, utilizing his abilities, becoming his own, and how different he can be from Peter, but not needing to fully rely on Peter as a person or a hero. They can coexist individually, but still work together as a team. And that's going to be very exciting to see the story unravel within Miles's game and how that will lead into the sequel, because since that is going to be, again, a mainly Peter Parker focused narrative. Again, to requote the Brian Intihar, Brian Horton interviews, they have said, we love Peter. He's still alive, obviously, in this game. And Miles, he's going to be in Symkaria with Mary Jane, so he's not going to be in New York. He's going to be out of the city. But by the time we do get to the next official sequel with Peter's game, he will be back as the main character and showing his story progress with the beats that they laid out in the first game, with, of course, Harry Osborn having the symbiote, Norman Osborn being teased to become the Green Goblin, Yuri Watanabe becoming the Wraith, and a lot of other cool character beats that can continue for both Miles, but mainly for Peter. And that's going to be super exciting to see the specific narrative plots that will be told in Miles' game, setting up the core story of the sequel.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, this game It's got a lot going for it. I mean, obviously, you and I are pretty high on this game. I think, where it's set up to be able to, yeah, tell its own story, grow Miles, and, it's got a lot to do, funny enough, right? Because it's a smaller thing. It's probably not going to be all that long to beat, but it really does have a lot of character growth, specifically with Miles to do, because you got to get them ready for where it's going. You got to kind of have to set up the scene. And I think it's, and one thing I do want to say is we can't, I don't think, kid ourselves with, I don't know if the right word to call it would be like a gloss, but I do feel like because of, how big this AAA, okay, this world, the Spider-Man world is, there is a thread that goes through it. Okay, so this game, taking place after, the first Spider-Man game and going directly, I think, because when you're selling a PS5, when you're selling this game this November, you have to, I feel like, get people ready for what's coming next. And even what we've seen from, like you said, countless interviews, even pictures, whether it be text conversations, right, with like Eddie Brock and stuff like that, there's a lot of world building going on. And so I think they're in a really good spot to be able to do all of that in this game while also saying, okay, well, let's do some things. And this is, by the way, I want to ask you this next. With this game, okay, we have a couple, characters that are coming in. We have a couple characters, like you said, with even Peter and MJ, right, that are coming out. Do you think, because we also know from interviews they've said that some of the plot lines of the first game may not even be touched here, may be, very little touched, and because obviously there's bigger plans for it. So let me ask you this. We've seen a couple, we've actually seen like the main, we can call it, villain of this game, right? Do you think that they're going to kind of limit what happens to this game in this game? You know what I mean? So do you think that some of
Right.
the beats that happen in this game are going to carry over, or do you think this is more of a Miles character growth that can be referenced in the second one, but they'll keep a lot of the stuff just in this game?
It's a really good question to ask because that could be a circumstance for someone who mainly either loves Peter Parker as a character, but may not be too fond of Miles. So what Insomniac have been trying to say is that this is the core next step within this franchise. So what that tells me is that you should play this game if you truly want to continue on to the journey in the Marvel Spider-Man universe for Insomniac's games. So say, for example, the sequel comes out, Marvel Spider-Man 2 in 2022. You've played Spider-Man PS4 in 2018. You've also played Spider-Man Remastered that we're getting now for the PlayStation 5, but you don't play Miles. Will you still need to play Miles in order to get the full scope of where the story is going by the time the official sequel comes out? And I do think that will be the case because
Right.
I think they will still feature Miles in the sequel because by the time we finish his own game, he will eventually become his own Spider-Man. He'll have his whole power set fleshed out. He will know how to be his own hero without Peter around. But then you can see how that evolution of the characters can grow when they team up again together. And now, as Peter is Spider-Man 9 years into his career as the web slinger, and Miles, by the time the official sequel comes out, will probably be like a couple of years into his overall lifespan as his own hero. So if they want to set up stuff originally, because they do seem like they're kind of reusing some other villains in Miles's game, of course, with Rhino, because
Right.
Miles as a character has only been around for like less than 10 years. He was created in 2011 and he doesn't have his own unique iconic villains as much as Peter does. So that's why Insomniac is trying to revitalize older characters like the Tinkerer and bring back older characters that we saw in the first game like Rhino. That whole Rhino sequence looked
Right.
incredible and he's clearly the first big bad of the game to try and establish how Miles is coming into his own right as a hero. But now seeing that Miles is going to have to take out someone like the Tinkerer on his own without Peter there is going to be a very interesting challenge to see him overcome and will most likely be brought up again by the time the official sequel comes out because we already saw that in Miles' game during the Game Informer coverage. You see that scene where Peter and Miles are talking and they directly bring up Dr. Octopus. So they're clearly directly linking the events from the first game, following up with Miles. And then by the time the official sequel comes out, I think they will follow up again events from Miles that occur in his game into the official sequel with Peter. And whether or not we also end up receiving villains in Miles's game, like we've been teased previously in the recent Game Informer coverage and the Insomniac Daily Bugle post with a character like Aaron Davis,
Mm-hmm.
aka the Prowler, if he ends up becoming a core villain in Miles's game, and if he ends up having to fight his own uncle, how is that going to affect Miles by the time the story continues in the sequel? What type of sacrifices or heroic deeds is he going to need to fulfill in his game that will evolve him even further into the story with the sequel, with the black suit being incorporated for Peter's character, with Norman becoming Green Goblin, all these potential story beats that could occur. We don't know for sure if they will occur, but the possibility of them occurring is what makes this so fascinating within the universe that Insomniac is crafting.
Definitely. I think, and like you even said with the villain thing, it's really cool what they can do with this game, right? Because you can, I think, well, firstly, you can grow his character. Okay, you can make him very, very more likable than he already is, which I think he's pretty darn likable. You can make him very powerful. You can make him, come into his own, set him up for what seems to be, Spider-Man 2, like you said, and like they've said, mainly a Spider-Man and Peter Parker thing. But if they did maybe mess around with like a GTA 5 kind of mechanics, being able to jump around characters, which I don't doubt that they would do at all, that would be very, very cool. And then when we talk about the villains, yeah, you're right. Well, one, when we talk about like carrying storylines, I feel like there has to be something, whether it's Prowler, whether it's the Tinkerer or whatever. I feel like there's got to be something in Miles that's going to stay with his character long term, right? It could be a fight, it could be, an action that happens, whatever, but it's got to be something that will then, again, the thread will appear again in Spider-Man 2. So we know, okay, and that's like you were saying too, you have to play Miles. I think with all games, especially I guess a game in like a lineage like this, you probably should and you probably will. I don't think it'll be the most necessary thing in the world, because what I could see happening, and that'll be the next and final question to you, I could see some potential villains or some potential story beats starting and wrapping up in Miles. But then also, like you said, whether it's Prowler, whether maybe the Tinkerer ends up, carrying on and going into Spider-Man 2, whether they do something at the end with like a Norman, like an end, an end credit kind of scene, I do think there'll be something that's not ended in Miles that will then appear in the second game. And so that goes to my question, maybe not necessarily predicting the ending, but if you had to, do you think they would make it very blatant? Like, do you think they would do kind of an ending like they did with Spider-Man, the 2018, where they make it very apparent, like, okay, there's more things going on with Norman? Do you think they would do that with maybe a villain from the first game? Do you think they would do it with a villain introduced in Miles? How do you think maybe Miles would end and how it could lead into it too?
Well, what I love the most about what's going on now, if you have been keeping up with the Insomniac coverage, and you viewers as well, if you've seen like their Daily Bugle posts and their PlayStation blogs and all the analysis they've done in universe for Marvel's New York and
Yeah.
how that's connecting to the characters, they're setting up a lot without us having even played the game yet. I mean, there was an article from the Daily Bugle talking about Norman's investors backing out of Oscorp, of course, heavily teasing the fact that Norman will probably be losing his company and eventually turning down a darker path as the Green Goblin. Whether or not we will see him as the Green Goblin in Miles' game is still yet to be determined, but it's heavily setting up the core assets of what will be prominently featured in Peter's story. Because for Miles' story, they have to have a very fine line to walk down, because they can't show off, of course, like if Venom was the main villain, because that doesn't really necessarily relate to Miles, more so it does to Peter. So for Miles' game, they can set up the teasing, like you said previously, Eddie Brock from the Daily Bugle, but they also have the Oscorp stuff with what we've seen in the first game coming back in Miles' game. Roxxon as the energy company, what are they up to? The underground, how is that going to affect Miles and the city as well? All these plot points that they're setting up, so many possibilities of what could happen is incredible. But one thing that I find the most interesting for Miles' character and for Peter's character is actually, crazy enough, Aaron Davis, where if you look on the Game Informer cover story online, or if you've read the magazine yourself, they directly confirm that the Tinkerer, spoiler, I guess, is not the leader of the Underground. That was said in the article itself from Game Informer. They've described that, saying that we don't know who sits at the top of the Underground, but one of the top lieutenants is the Tinkerer, an old Marvel Comics villain created in 1963. Back then, the Tinkerer was an old man who blackmailed politicians by bugging their electronics. Now, the Tinkerer is a youthful, athletic woman who speaks through a modulated voice. So they're clearly doing a different take on the character that we haven't seen. The same thing can be applied to Harry Osborn becoming Venom instead of Eddie Brock. And also that the Tinkerer is there confirmed to not be the leader of the Underground, which makes me think that it could be Aaron Davis as the Prowler, leading all the group together, trying to take revenge on Roxxon for whatever reason, and seeing how Miles could discover the identity of his uncle as this villain would be a very emotional scene. Like you said, the Doc Ock and Peter connection that we got in the first game could reappear again here from Miles and his uncle, and how that could help him grow as a hero, learning about the tragedy and triumph of what it means to be Spider-Man. And I think that is a very complex and essential character trait to explore for Spider-Man as a whole. And seeing how that was applied perfectly for Peter in the first game to be reapplied here for Miles is going to be a wonderful sight to see. And for the story, again, we do have the actors coming back with Najee Jeter and Yuri Lowenthal reprising their roles as Miles and Peter. How that performance is going to convey even more of an emotional connection to the characters that we already received in the first game, and then building up for an even deeper impact to fully flesh out even more in the official sequel. Once we do get Yuri Watanabe as Wraith, once we do get Norman as Green Goblin, and of course, once we do get either Harry or Eddie as Venom. I think it will be Harry Osborn, since that's what they showed in the first game at the post-credit scene, but there is so much depth to explore. There's so much life to be filled in with within the universe that they're crafting, and the way that they're trying to flesh out Miles first in his own game, so that way we can convey an even bigger story with Peter by the time the official sequel comes in, is, I think, a very smart idea, because that way they don't have to balance between Peter and Miles in the sequel, because we'll already have a fully fleshed out story with Miles and Peter in their own respective games. So then when the official sequel comes out, they'll have so many different opportunities to take with whatever direction they decide to go in. And I cannot wait to see what that looks like.
Absolutely. They've done a really good job. And like you said, there's actually a couple ways they could have gone, but they didn't have to do this game. They could have just, in fact, maybe not doing this game could have helped out with Spider-Man 2. Like, we don't actually know. Maybe it could shave off 6 months or a year, but they decided, this was the proper path to go. And like you said, like Dave said, I think they're right in that you do get to fully develop a character like this. You get to bring in new story beats, like you said, with the Prowler, which, to be honest, could be something, like we were talking about the ending, could be something even he does find out at the end that his uncle is the Prowler. That would be something very, like you said, very personal to him, that would make a big impact. And it could even be resolved in 2, because while 2, again, like we've said, is a Peter story, I mean, Miles will definitely, he'll be in it quite a bit. And you got to imagine they have a longer path in mind, even past Spider-Man 2. So, I could see the ending of this game being a closing of one chapter and a beginning of another, where, yeah, maybe the Tinkerer doesn't actually make it past this game. Maybe, we don't, I mean, she could technically, but, the options to them are endless, right? They could do it. They could not do it. I could see, though, them closing some doors and then leaving some open, whether that they started it in Miles. And it'll be interesting. Like you said, one of the things you said earlier, too, which I do think is important, and I don't know how many times I've said this, but, with this being a Miles story, right? And we know, Peter Parker, the face change, that's quite something. Evan and I have talked about that quite a bit, but this is his story, and to put Peter too much into it, and not even just Peter, because we know by, everything Evan said, everything they've said, they're not. They're kind of pushing him aside and making this kind of a, hey, you're growing, you have to be New York Spider-Man, right? It's up to you.
Right.
And that's, that's good. At the same time, you don't want to put other things into. So when I think of, okay, well, could they do another ending where maybe they do like the part 2 to the ending they did in the first game, something with a Harry Osborn or Norman? The question is, would they do that? Is that and kind of invading too much on, you know what I mean? Is that invading too much on Miles' story? Do you do an end credit scene that's very Miles specific that will still be in 2? Or maybe you just end his story, I guess the story arc that they're doing in this game. Do you end that in the ending, and then the post-credit scene is, no, you know what? We can give people that buy this game, we can give them a tease as to where the overall story is going in the next one. And, you can even look at like Marvel movies as an example. They've done that quite often. At the same time, they are a little bit more specific to the movie, but they don't have to be, right? They can be a little bit farther reaching.
Right. There's so many different possibilities that they can take, since they don't have to limit themselves from what the movies are doing or what the comics are doing or what the shows have done. This is their own thing. This is their own unique take on the characters that we've established in the first game. There's so many different options for them to explore for Peter. Again, what I hope does not happen is that they backtrack. What we know is that Peter in Miles is going to be a photographer again for
Right.
Mary Jane, who works at the Daily Bugle. The reason why I like the first game so much is because Peter was a scientist, and
Yeah.
Mary Jane filled the role of the photographer at the Daily Bugle. That was kind of a more progressive take on Mary Jane, while they evolved Peter's character as a scientist. And what I love the description about him as a side tangent is that they said, what if Peter could help as many people out of the suit as he can in the suit. And what I love about that is because that is his passion. He's a nerd. He loves science, and applying that into his career path as a scientist who was working for Otto Octavius making prosthetics was one of, if not the coolest narrative points within the entire game for me. I love this version of Peter so, so much. And Miles as well, evolving. Before he was a nerd and also very scientific, now in the game, in his own story, he's a music producer. He's kind of becoming his own type of hip hop, creator, and he's also Spider-Man. So this is a very, current take on the character that is very, connected to the youth and exploring the traits of what makes Miles his own and what Peter is making his own as well. However, I hope they don't make him go back to the Daily Bugle by the time the official sequel comes out. And instead, I want him to further his progress as a scientist, working at possibly Oscorp, kind of getting to the bottom of what's happening with the Devil's Breath situation, because Aunt May died, spoiler, from the Devil's Breath situation that was born from Oscorp. So you would think that as a scientist, Peter may want to investigate a bit more as to what's really going on there, maybe work at a more progressive company like Horizon Labs, maybe expand his scientific knowledge there instead. I think that'd be cool. And Miles, seeing how he's becoming a music producer, maybe how he can kind of maybe create his own brand or something, kind of evolving his character in that way, but also seeing how his best friend, Genki Lee, is also a tech genius, and him and Miles are coordinating with each other since Genki knows that Miles is Spider-Man. Just a lot of depth with these characters and the relationships that they have with one another is truly what engages me as a fan in the story. Not necessarily the graphics or the gameplay, even though those are essential qualities for this product. I, as a fan, care about the narrative. Where are we going with the story? Where are we taking these characters next? And how can we continue to grow with them as we play as them? That is what video games do for me as a consumer and as a player. What I love more about games than movies is because we are interacting with these characters on their journey, following them through and through, becoming them as we play more of them. And I think that with Miles evolving from a small, youthful, energetic teenager who loves Spider-Man as a fan to now being a Spider-Man and teasing that more into the sequel. If they do that as a post-credit scene, maybe Peter will return from his trip by the end of Miles' story. Peter's back in the city. Miles is with him. They're side by side. Miles has grown as a Spider-Man, and they're fully ready to take on the next threat that comes out in the sequel. Then, because they had 2 post-credit scenes in the first game, if they do that again with Miles' game, I think the first post-credit scene would flesh out the relationship again between Peter and Miles, which would also be a nice homage to the first post-credit scene that was in the first game. And the second post-credit scene could tease Venom, could tease Green Goblin, could tease the next main threat that will be the main antagonist of the sequel, because they've clearly said in interviews that is their main plan going forward, that they are going to focus on, obviously, who they teased with Venom and Green Goblin being the core threats of the next game. So setting that up by the end of Miles' story with a post-credit tease or with some maybe Daily Bugle news articles in the game or some references throughout the story would kind of ease players into the transition of, oh, this is who we're going up against as Peter and Miles in the official sequel. Both of these characters have now become their own. They're now fully grown as individuals, and now they're ready to take down some serious foes by the time the next game comes out.
Totally agree. It's gonna be special, and like you said too, we focus a lot on the gameplay. What can the PS5 do for it, and the DualSense and stuff like that. But you could even look at the stuff for Spider-Man PS4. The story could have actually been the most underrated part. That I just don't think a lot of people maybe focused on the story as much as, oh my God, look how amazing this feels and how good this looks and how well they did in all those regards. But the story and world building were at the very worst, I would say, were very solid, and I think they're taking it very seriously. And like you said, even with the stuff they've been doing with all of the teases and world building through the Daily Bugle stuff, you don't really, not many companies do stuff like that. And so it's actually pretty impressive Insomniac is taking that, that route to do it. So guys, as we end here, if you guys are not already subscribed to Evan, I'm going to leave all of his stuff in the description below. Obviously, again, he's done an amazing job at covering this. It's honestly a pleasure to work with you, Evan. Thank you so much for joining me. I can't wait to see what you do for Miles when it comes out. This is I'm excited for you. I'm going to be covering it. I'm excited to play it. But to see somebody like you so passionate about it, it must be a really, really fun time in your life.
It's just an absolute treat just to be able to talk to someone as wonderful as you who loves this character just as much, if not more, than I do. Just being able to conversate with fans who embody what makes Spider-Man so special, what makes me as a content creator and as a fan, just the most excited in the world just to be able to interact with people as amazing as yourself. And just for me, like seeing a Miles Morales standalone game, I never would have thought that would happen. Just as a side topic, like just a Peter Parker Spider-Man game, we received like a million of them in the past. That's fine.
Yeah.
The first game that Insomniac did is my personal favorite video game of all time, ever, ever. Not just for Spider-Man, just in general. I think it is a true achievement in superhero gaming and just open world traversal in games in general. And seeing that same exact treatment and passion inputted into Miles is going to be an absolute spectacle to witness, and is also going to be extremely special for a lot of people who want to be represented in such a meaningful way to a hero that means so much to so many. And seeing that flesh out and evolve with a character like Miles at the forefront of his own game is a absolute treat to see. And just fans like yourself make it worthwhile for me. Being excited, sharing the hype with just so many people is just amazing. And I cannot wait until November 12th.
Truly exciting time. So, guys, make sure you stay tuned and look out for the next videos of Evan and I. We're definitely going to, obviously, we're going to be doing more stuff for Miles as we get closer and closer, and then obviously when the game releases. Thank you guys so much for watching. Make sure you check out all of Evan's stuff, and we will see you all on the next video.